The ledgers were still damp when they pulled Beauregard Finch's body from the bayou on September 9th, 1847. Rope bound his wrists to a cypress barge, and account books, his own, pages swollen and illegible, had been tied around his waist like ballast. The coroner noted water in the lungs, bruising consistent with a fall, and no signs of foul play beyond the peculiar arrangement of the restraints. The official record listed drowning while fleeing creditors. But three things didn't fit. First, Beauregard Finch owed no debts. Second, the rope was the same hemp used in the plantation's tobacco barn, a grade he'd special ordered from Mobile. Third, his son Ellis, who'd inherited everything by noon the next day, showed no grief. He showed up to identify the body wearing his father's watch, already running 10 minutes fast, and signed the death certificate without reading it. Then he walked back to the house and freed every enslaved person on the property before sunset. The Louisiana heat in July of 1846 moved like syrup, thick enough to taste, carrying the smell of turned earth and cane smoke from the fields beyond Belle Azure Plantation. Inside the main house, carved mahogany furniture absorbed the humidity until the wood groaned at night, and silver tarnished faster than the house staff could polish it. Beauregard Finch kept the windows shuttered against the sun, so the dining room at midday felt like a crypt lit by reluctant candles. Ellis Finch, 23 years old and 260 pounds, sat at the far end of the table and tried to make himself smaller. His father occupied the head, carving roast duck with surgical precision, each slice thin as paper. Beauregard was lean, silver-haired, and carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who believed the world owed him deference simply for existing. He did not look at Ellis while he spoke. "You are an embarrassment to this family." Beauregard's voice was quiet, which made it worse. Shouting could be tuned out. This low register demanded attention. "Your uncle managed 4 plantations by your age. Your grandfather sat in the state legislature. You cannot ride a horse without the animal limping afterward." Ellis kept his eyes on his plate. The duck was dry. Everything was always dry. His father believed rich food made men weak, so meals at Belle Azure were monuments to joyless nutrition: boiled vegetables, lean meat, bread without butter. Ellis had learned years ago that arguing only extended the lectures, so he stayed silent and let the words wash over him like the heat. "The Charbonneau girl is visiting next month," Beauregard continued. "Her father owns 6,000 acres in Plaquemines Parish. I have arranged for you to escort her to the autumn social in Baton Rouge. You will dance with her. You will be charming. You will not humiliate me by sweating through your coat or needing to sit down after one waltz." "Yes, sir." Beauregard set down his knife. "Do you understand what is at stake here, Ellis? This estate has been in our family for 3 generations. I will not watch it pass to a man who cannot command respect from his own reflection." He stood, leaving his plate half full. "Naomi will bring your supper to your room tonight. Perhaps eating alone will remind you that inheritance is earned, not given." Ellis waited until his father's footsteps faded up the main staircase. Then he pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against cypress floorboards, and walked toward the back of the house, where the kitchen occupied a separate building to keep fire risk away from the main structure. The heat outside hit like a physical blow, but Ellis barely noticed anymore. He'd spent his whole life learning how to endure. Naomi was at the wash basin, her hands moving in efficient circles over a cast-iron skillet. She was 31, sharp-featured, with hair she kept wrapped in indigo cloth and eyes that missed nothing. When Ellis entered, She didn't turn around. "He cut you with the soft voice today," she said. "That's worse than the yelling. He wants me to marry Catherine Charbonneau." "I know. Whole parish knows. Your father's not exactly subtle." Naomi dried her hands and pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from the shelf beside the stove. "Cornbread and ham. Made it this morning before he woke up. You eat that duck he served, you'll be hungry again in an hour." Ellis took the bundle and sat on the kitchen's back step. Naomi joined him. Though sitting with white family, even Ellis, was the kind of thing that could get her sold if Beauregard saw. But Beauregard never came to the kitchen. He considered it beneath him. They sat in silence for a while, Ellis eating, Naomi watching the sun drop toward the tree line. Finally, she spoke. "You know why he hates you so much?" Ellis shook his head. "Because you remind him of your mama. She was soft, too. Kind. He thought he could make her hard by keeping her pregnant and isolated, but she just got sadder. Then she died birthing your baby sister, who died too, and he blamed the softness. Now he sees it in you and thinks if he can just beat it out, carve it out, starve it out, you'll turn into the son he wanted." "He's not wrong," Ellis said quietly. "I am weak." Naomi snorted. "Weak men don't sneak food to the field hands when the overseer's looking the other way. Weak men don't teach themselves to read ledgers so they can check if their fathers are shorting people on rations. You're not weak, Ellis. You're just kind, and your father doesn't know the difference." Ellis turned to look at her. In the amber light, her profile was strong, certain. She'd been at Belle Azur since before Ellis was born, purchased at auction in New Orleans, after her previous owner died without heirs. She worked the house because she was clever and could keep accounts in her head better than most free men with formal schooling. Beauregard valued her for that, but he'd never admit it out loud. "How do you stand it?" Ellis asked. "Knowing you could do better than any of us, but you're stuck here because of—" He trailed off, not sure how to finish. "Because the law says I'm property?" Naomi finished for him. "I stand it because I don't have a choice. But you do. That's the difference between us. You could leave tomorrow, walk to the river, get on a steamboat, disappear into Memphis or St. Louis. But you don't. You know why?" Ellis shook his head. "Because despite everything, you still think you can fix this place. Fix him. Fix yourself. That's not weakness. That's just stupid hope." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "But hope's worth more than you think, Ellis. Don't let him take that from you, too." The question wasn't whether Ellis would break. Naomi had been teaching Ellis mathematics for 2 years, though neither of them called it that. It started the summer he turned 21, when Beauregard left for Charleston on business, and Ellis found himself alone with the plantation's account books. The numbers made no sense. Income exceeded expenses by impossible margins, yet the enslaved population was shrinking. 15 people sold in the previous year, and the fields were producing less cotton than the ledgers claimed. "Your father's cooking the books," Naomi had explained, spreading the ledgers across the kitchen table after midnight. "See here? He's claiming 800 bales to the brokers in New Orleans, but we only shipped 600. The difference he pockets. And here," she pointed to another column, "he's writing off field hands as dead when he's really selling them downriver. Saves him from paying Louisiana's transfer tax." Ellis had stared at the numbers until they blurred. "That's illegal. That's business." Naomi's finger traced another line. "And this? He's borrowing against next year's crop to pay this year's debts. It's a pyramid. Long as cotton prices stay high, it works. But if prices drop or a harvest fails..." she made a toppling gesture with her hand. From that night forward, Naomi taught Ellis how to read between the lines of commerce, how to spot doctored invoices, how to calculate actual yield versus reported yield by weighing wagon loads and checking bale density, how to track which field hands were most productive, which tools needed replacing, which acres were exhausted, and which were still fertile. It was a shadow education, conducted in stolen hours when Beauregard was in town or locked in his study with bourbon and bitterness. The lessons changed something in Ellis. He'd always been aware of the plantation's violence, the whippings, the family separations, the casual cruelty Beauregard called discipline. But seeing it rendered in numerical columns made it undeniable. Each line was a person reduced to inputs and outputs, valued only for the labor they could provide before they wore out. "Why are you showing me this?" Ellis asked one night in August of 1846. Naomi was silent for a long moment. Then, "Because someday he'll die and you'll inherit. And when that day comes, you need to know exactly what kind of machine you're inheriting. Then you can decide whether to keep it running or break it down for parts. He's my father. He's a ledger with a pulse." Naomi closed the books and stacked them carefully. "And you're not him, Ellis. Not yet. But every day you stay here, you become a little more complicit. A little more like him. That's how this place works. It takes good people and grinds them down until they forget what good means." Ellis thought about that for weeks afterward. Complicity. He'd never considered himself complicit. He didn't beat anyone, didn't split up families, didn't pocket the profits. But he also didn't leave. He ate the food prepared by enslaved hands. He wore the clothes laundered by women who couldn't say no. He slept in a house built by people who would never own houses themselves. What would you do, living every day inside a system that granted you comfort purchased with other people's suffering? The realization was slow, creeping, like water seeping through levee walls. It happened on the night of September 14th, 1846. Beauregard returned from Baton Rouge 2 days early. His business had concluded faster than expected, and went straight to Ellis's room at midnight to discuss something about the Charbonneau arrangement. What he found instead was Ellis and Naomi on the narrow bed, fully clothed, but holding each other with the quiet intimacy of people who'd long since stopped pretending they were anything other than what they were. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Beauregard crossed the room, grabbed Naomi by the arm, and dragged her into the hallway. Ellis scrambled after them, his mind blank with panic, but his body moved too slowly. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, Beauregard had already shoved Naomi down them. She caught herself on the railing, but not before her shoulder struck the banister hard enough to make a sound like green wood snapping. Beauregard's voice was glacial. "Thomas, Henry, get up here." The 2 field foremen appeared within minutes, still pulling on their shirts. They took one look at the scene, Beauregard rigid with rage, Ellis frozen, Naomi crumpled at the base of the stairs, and understood immediately. "Tie her to the post in the yard," Beauregard said. 20 lashes. I want everyone to see what happens when property forgets its place." "Father, please," Ellis started. Beauregard turned on him. "You will watch. Every stroke. And if you look away, if you close your eyes, if you show one moment of weakness, I will add 10 more. Do you understand me?" Ellis understood. He followed them outside into the humid September night, where a crowd was already gathering. The enslaved population of Belle Azure, 37 people, assembled in the yard like silent witnesses to an execution. Naomi was tied to the whipping post, her back exposed. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She looked straight ahead, her jaw set, and when Thomas raised the lash, she didn't make a sound until the 5th strike. By the 10th, she was screaming. By the 15th, she'd passed out. Beauregard let the full 20 land. Then he turned to Ellis, who was shaking so hard he could barely stand. "You will marry Catherine Charbonneau in the spring," Beauregard said. "You will never speak to Naomi again. And if I find you've disobeyed me in any way, I will sell her to the sugar fields in Terrebonne Parish, where women last 3 years if they're lucky. Do we have an understanding?" Ellis nodded. He couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only watch as they cut Naomi down and carried her to the quarters, her back raw and bleeding. Beauregard wasn't finished. And one more thing. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Ellis. "If I ever catch you with her again, I won't have her whipped. I'll have you castrated. There are doctors in New Orleans who perform the procedure on livestock. I see no reason it couldn't be adapted for a son who insists on acting like an animal." Inheritance now carried a price written in scars. Ellis played his part well. He escorted Catherine Charbonneau to the autumn social in Baton Rouge on October 23, 1846, and danced with her twice. Once a waltz, once a quadrille. She was 17, blonde, and bored by everything except horses and French novels. She tolerated Ellis with polite indifference, the way one tolerated a distant cousin at a funeral. Beauregard watched from across the ballroom with a whiskey in hand and what passed for satisfaction on his face. Ellis smiled. He laughed at appropriate moments. He discussed cotton prices with Catherine's father and agreed that the new tariff proposals in Washington were an outrage. He did not think about Naomi, who was still recovering in the quarters, her back a landscape of scars that would never fully heal. He did not think about the whipping post, or the way the crowd had watched in silence, or the fact that not one person, not even Ellis himself, had stepped forward to stop it. Instead, he thought about ledgers. At night, alone in his room, Ellis pored over his father's account books with new eyes. He wasn't looking for proof of fraud anymore. He was looking for vulnerabilities, and what he found was both simpler and more devastating than he'd expected. Beauregard Finch was not a wealthy man. He looked wealthy. The house, the clothes, the silver, but it was all leveraged. Belle Azur was mortgaged to a bank in New Orleans. The enslaved population was collateral on loans from 3 different creditors. Even the furniture was technically owned by a factor in Baton Rouge who'd advanced Beauregard money against future cotton harvests. The whole operation was a house of cards held together by bluff and the assumption that cotton prices would stay high forever. What if they didn't? Better yet, what if people believed they wouldn't? Ellis began making copies of his father's ledgers, not the official ones Beauregard showed to banks and brokers, but the real ones hidden in a locked drawer in his study, the ones that showed the true debt, the falsified shipments, the creative accounting that kept Belle Azur solvent in appearance only. Ellis worked slowly, methodically, copying pages by candlelight and hiding them in a space he'd hollowed out beneath a loose floorboard in his room. Naomi recovered slowly. Ellis wasn't allowed to see her, but he received reports from the other house staff. Her back was healing, though infection had set in twice and she'd spent a week delirious with fever. When she finally returned to work in mid-November, she moved stiffly, carefully, and refused to make eye contact with Ellis when they passed in the hallways. It wasn't until December 3rd that they spoke again. Ellis found her in the kitchen late at night, working on the next day's bread. He closed the door behind him and waited until she acknowledged his presence. "I'm sorry," he said. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," Naomi replied without looking up. Her hands worked the dough with mechanical precision. "Sorry is just words people say to make themselves feel better." "I know." "Do you?" She finally looked at him, and her eyes were hard. "You know what happened to me happens to women here every day? You know your father's visited my cabin twice since that night, to remind me who owns what. You know he made me stand in the yard yesterday and watch while he sold Marcus to a trader headed for Mississippi, just to show everyone what happens when someone steps out of line." Ellis felt his stomach turn. Marcus was 16, one of the field hands who'd shown talent with carpentry. Beauregard had promised him he could apprentice with the estate's blacksmith. Now he was gone, sold downriver for no reason except to send a message. "I can't undo what he did," Ellis said carefully. "But I can make sure he doesn't do it again." Naomi laughed, bitter and sharp. "How? You going to challenge him? Fight him? You tried that and lost before you even started." "I'm going to destroy him." Ellis pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and set it on the table. "These are the names of everyone Beauregard owes money to. Banks, factors, private creditors. All told, he's $38,000 in debt, with assets worth maybe $20,000 on a good day. If those people all came calling at once." Naomi stared at the paper, then at Ellis. "How do you make them come calling?" "I don't," Ellis said. "You do." The plan took shape over the winter of 1846. Naomi had connections Ellis didn't, networks that ran through the enslaved communities up and down the river, invisible to white eyes but efficient as any telegraph. Through those networks, she could spread rumors, plant seeds of doubt, make creditors nervous. The first seed was simple. Beauregard Finch's cotton yield was down, not catastrophically, but enough to worry people who'd loaned him money. Naomi mentioned it in conversation with traders who came through the plantation buying eggs and vegetables. She let it slip to a preacher who visited the quarters to deliver Sunday sermons. Within 3 weeks, a factor in New Orleans sent a polite inquiry about Bel Azure's upcoming harvest projections. Beauregard responded with reassurances and doctored figures. The factor accepted them. But the question had been asked, and in the world of credit and collateral, questions bred suspicion. The second seed was more elaborate. Ellis forged a letter on Beauregard's letterhead. The plantation kept a supply in his study, along with his personal seal, requesting a loan extension from a bank in Baton Rouge. The letter claimed cash flow difficulties due to a disputed shipment and delayed payment from brokers. Ellis deliberately made the request small, reasonable, the kind of thing a prudent businessman might do. Except Beauregard never sent it. Ellis did. And when the bank replied, offering the extension but asking for updated collateral assessments, Beauregard had no idea what they were talking about. His confusion, relayed to the bank in an irritated letter demanding to know why they thought he needed an extension, only made things worse. The bank assumed he was covering up financial trouble by denying he'd asked for help. "You're playing with fire," Naomi warned in January of 1847. "He's going to figure out someone's moving against him." "Let him figure it out," Ellis said. "By the time he does, it'll be too late." The third seed was the cruelest. Ellis hired a debt collector, a man named Thibault, who operated out of a Baton Rouge boarding house and specialized in extracting payment from planters who'd overextended themselves. Ellis paid him $50 for money he'd skimmed from the household accounts and gave him a list of Beauregard's creditors. Thibault's job was simple. Visit each creditor and ask, very politely, whether they'd considered calling in Beauregard Finch's outstanding loans. Not because Thibault had been hired by anyone in particular, just because he'd heard rumors. Rumors about declining productivity, about falsified shipments, about a man leveraged so deeply that one bad harvest would bring the whole structure down. Thibault was good at his job. By March, 2 of Beauregard's creditors had requested early repayment. By April, a factor in Mobile had seized 3 bales of Belle Azure cotton as partial restitution for an unpaid advance. Beauregard was furious, scrambling, borrowing from new sources to pay off old debts, digging himself deeper with each transaction. Ellis watched it unfold with a strange detachment. He'd expected to feel guilt, or at least ambivalence. Instead, he felt something closer to relief. For the first time in his life, he was acting instead of enduring. The weight of inheritance was shifting from a burden to a weapon. Naomi watched him too, with an expression that was hard to read. One night in April, she asked, "You ever think about what happens after he's gone?" "Every day." And I free everyone, sign the papers, let people leave or stay as they choose. Naomi was silent for a long moment. Then, "What about me?" "Especially you," she nodded slowly. "You know he won't go quietly, though. Men like your father, they burn everything down before they admit defeat. You need to be ready for that." Ellis wasn't ready. He thought he was, but he wasn't. The first official demand came on May 19th, 1847. A lawyer from New Orleans named Dufresne appeared at Belle Azure with a writ of execution, authorizing the seizure of property to satisfy a debt of $11,000 owed to the Commercial Bank of Louisiana. Beauregard met him on the front gallery, his face purple with rage. "I paid that loan in full last year," Beauregard snarled. "The bank's records show otherwise," Dufresne replied, unfolding a document. "According to this ledger, you paid $6,000 against the principal and promised the remainder by March of this year. It is now May. The bank has been more than patient. Those records are fraudulent. Then I suggest you take it up with the courts. In the meantime, I'm authorized to inventory assets for auction if payment is not rendered within 30 days. Beauregard slammed the door in Dufresne's face. Then he called for Ellis. "Something is happening," Beauregard said, pacing his study like a caged animal. "Someone is moving against me. Creditors I've worked with for years are suddenly hostile. Debts I paid are magically unpaid. It's sabotage." Ellis kept his face neutral. "Who would sabotage you?" "Competitors, rivals. That bastard Charbonneau, maybe. He's always resented that his daughter might end up with a better match." Beauregard grabbed a ledger from his desk and threw it across the room. "I built this plantation from nothing. My father left me dirt and debts, and I turned it into something that matters. And now some coward is trying to destroy it from the shadows. What are you going to do?" Beauregard stopped pacing. His eyes, pale and cold, fixed on Ellis with sudden focus. "I'm going to find out who's responsible, and then I'm going to make them wish they'd never been born." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Ellis felt his pulse quicken, but forced himself to stay calm. "In the meantime, do you have a plan for the bank?" "I'll borrow from other sources, consolidate, refinance." Beauregard's voice was tighter now, less certain. "This is a temporary setback, nothing more." But it wasn't temporary. Within a week, 2 more creditors appeared with writs and demands. A factor in Mobile wanted $5,000. A cotton broker in Natchez wanted $7,000. Beauregard couldn't pay them all, so he tried to pay none of them, hoping to negotiate extensions. Instead, the creditors filed liens against Belle Azure's assets, the land, the buildings, the enslaved population. Under Louisiana law, those liens gave them the right to force a sale if Beauregard defaulted. Ellis watched his father spiral. Beauregard stopped sleeping, stopped eating regular meals. He spent hours locked in his study, scratching out frantic letters to lawyers and bankers, trying to untangle a web that grew tighter with every passing day. The household staff walked on eggshells, terrified of triggering his temper. Even the field foreman gave him wide berth. Naomi saw it too. "He's close to breaking," she said in early June. "But breaking's not enough. Broken men are dangerous, unpredictable. We need him gone, Ellis. Not just ruined, gone." "I didn't plan for—" "I know what you planned for," Naomi interrupted. "You planned to bankrupt him, humiliate him, take the plantation out from under him, and then play the magnanimous son who fixes his father's mistakes. But that's not how this ends. He's not going to hand you Belle Azure and walk away. He's going to fight until there's nothing left to fight with." Ellis knew she was right. He'd miscalculated. He'd thought financial ruin would be enough to break Beauregard's grip on the plantation, but he hadn't accounted for the man's sheer stubbornness, or his willingness to drag everyone down with him rather than admit defeat. "So, what do we do?" Ellis asked. Naomi's expression hardened. "We give him a way out, a door he thinks is escape, and when he walks through it, we close it behind him. The difference between ruin and death is just timing. Creating a credible warrant required more than just forging Beauregard's signature. It required understanding how the legal system worked, how debt collection functioned, and how desperate men made decisions. Ellis had the first two. Naomi's brother Samuel had the third. Samuel worked a timber barge on the Mississippi, ferrying cypress logs from the swamps to sawmills in New Orleans. He was 42, scarred from a decade of hard labor, and carried a quiet rage that made even dangerous men cautious around him. When Naomi sent word asking him to come to Belle Azure, he arrived on June 27, 1847, after dark, and waited in the woods beyond the quarters until Ellis and Naomi could slip away to meet him. "You want to kill a white man?" Samuel said. It wasn't a question. "We want him to disappear," Ellis corrected. "There's a difference." Samuel laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Not in the eyes of the law, there isn't. You kill a white man, even trash like your father, they'll hang every black person within 10 miles just to send a message. You understand that? That's why it has to look like he ran," Naomi said. "We're creating a scenario where he flees to avoid arrest. Then, in the swamps, he has an accident, no witnesses, no trail, just a man who made bad choices and paid the price." Samuel studied them both. "What's in it for me?" "Freedom," Ellis said. "For you, for Naomi, for everyone on this plantation. I'll sign manumission papers the day after Beauregard's gone." "Words are cheap." "I know. That's why I brought these." Ellis pulled a sheaf of documents from his coat. Pre-signed manumission papers for every enslaved person at Belle Azure, notarized by a lawyer in Baton Rouge who'd been happy to help for $50 and no questions. They're dated and sealed. The day he disappears, these become active. You can take yours and leave immediately. Samuel examined the papers by lantern light. Then he nodded. "Tell me the plan." The warrant was simple in concept, monstrous in execution. Ellis forged a complaint claiming Beauregard had defrauded the Commercial Bank of Louisiana of $18,000 through falsified collateral and doctored shipments. He filed it under the name of a fictitious New Orleans attorney, using an address that didn't exist. The complaint was then served by Thibault, the debt collector Ellis had hired months earlier, who was more than happy to play the role of county deputy for an extra $50. Thibault delivered the warrant on July 7, 1847, just after dawn. Beauregard, already frayed by weeks of financial pressure, read the document 3 times before the implications sank in. "This is a criminal charge," he said, his voice hollow. "They're accusing me of fraud." "I'm just the messenger," Thibault replied, tipping his hat. "You'll want to appear before the magistrate in Baton Rouge within the week. Otherwise, there'll be a bench warrant for your arrest." Beauregard spent the next 2 days trying to verify the complaint's legitimacy. He sent letters to lawyers in New Orleans. He rode to Baton Rouge himself to search court records. But the system was slow, bureaucratic, and deliberately opaque. By the time he realized the complaint was false, Ellis had already planted rumors that Beauregard was preparing to flee, selling valuables, withdrawing cash, making arrangements to disappear before the authorities could arrest him. None of it was true, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to feel true. On the evening of July 10th, Beauregard made his decision. Rather than face a trial, real or fabricated, he would run. He packed a satchel with cash, jewelry, and his father's pocket watch. He saddled his best horse, and at midnight, he rode south toward the bayou, planning to follow the waterways to New Orleans, where he could board a ship to Havana or Mobile and start over. He never made it past the Cypress breaks. Samuel and 3 other men, all bargemen, all with reasons to hate Beauregard Finch, were waiting at a clearing where the Belle Azure property line met the swamp. They appeared friendly at first, offering to guide Beauregard through the maze of channels and backwaters that could get a man lost for days if he didn't know the routes. "River's high this time of year," Samuel said, his voice easy, helpful. "Follow me and I'll get you to the steamboat landing by dawn." Beauregard hesitated. He recognized Samuel, Naomi's brother, one of the field hands he'd sold away 5 years earlier, only to have him bought by a timber company that paid him wages and let him move freely. Beauregard had always resented that sale, seeing it as a loss of control rather than a financial gain. "I know you," Beauregard said. "Yes, sir. Worked your fields before I was sold. No hard feelings about that. Business is business." Samuel gestured toward the dark water. "You want to make New Orleans or not?" Greed and fear outweighed caution. Beauregard followed. The bargemen led him deeper into the bayou, their flat-bottomed boat gliding through water black as ink. Cypress trees rose like cathedral pillars, their roots gnarled and tangled, their branches draped with moss that hung in curtains. The air smelled of rot and life in equal measure, decaying vegetation, fish, the faint musk of alligator. Beauregard sat rigid in the bow, his satchel clutched to his chest, watching the men row with practiced ease. It wasn't until they reached an isolated bend, miles from any road or settlement, that Samuel finally spoke the truth. "You know why I'm here, Mr. Finch?" Beauregard's hand moved toward the pistol in his coat, but Samuel was faster. He grabbed Beauregard's wrist and twisted until bone creaked. The pistol fell into the water with a soft splash. "I'm here because you sold me to pay off a gambling debt," Samuel continued, his voice calm. "Sold me away from my sister. Told the buyer I was troublesome, which dropped the price and made him work me twice as hard to get his money's worth. You didn't need to do that. You just did it because you could." Beauregard's face went pale. "I'll pay you. Whatever you want. Double what I got for you, triple. Just take me to New Orleans." Samuel looked at the other men, then back to Beauregard. "We don't want your money." He gestured, and the bargemen moved in unison, wrapping rope around Beauregard's wrists and tying him to a cypress stump that jutted from the water like a broken tooth. What happened next was efficient, brutal, and left no evidence. The ledgers Ellis had copied, the real ones, showing all of Beauregard's frauds and falsifications, were tied around the man's waist with iron chains. The bargemen positioned the load carefully, ensuring it would drag him under when they cut the rope securing him to the stump. Beauregard screamed. He begged. He promised land, money, freedom for everyone who let him live. But the bayou swallowed sound, and there was no one to hear him except trees and water and men who'd spent lifetimes learning to ignore white men's pleas. Samuel cut the rope at 3:47 in the morning on July 11, 1847. Beauregard Finch went under without a fight, his lungs filling with bayou water, his body sinking into mud that would hold him until the gases of decomposition brought him back to the surface weeks later. The bargemen cleaned the boat, burned the rope, and scattered the ashes. Then they rowed back to the timber camp as if nothing had happened. Because in the world they inhabited, nothing had happened. Another white man had died in the swamps, victim of poor navigation and bad judgment. It happened all the time. Some debts are paid in water and silence. The body surfaced on September 9th, 1847, caught in the roots of a deadfall tree 3 miles south of where Samuel had tied the ledgers to Beauregard's corpse. A pair of trappers found it and reported the discovery to the parish sheriff, who rode out with a coroner and 2 deputies to examine the remains. Decomposition had done its work. The body was bloated, discolored, and barely recognizable as human, let alone as Beauregard Finch. But the rope burns on the wrists were clear, as were the iron chains still wrapped around the waist. The ledgers had dissolved into pulp, but their presence was obvious. Rectangular impressions in the decay. Pages fused to flesh by water and time. The coroner made his notes with clinical detachment. Male, approximately 50 to 60 years of age. Rope ligatures indicate restraint, possibly self-applied. Drowning as cause of death, though bruising on the torso suggests impact with submerged objects. Time of death estimated 6 to 8 weeks prior. Suicide? One of the deputies asked. Or misadventure. Man ties his own hands to keep from swimming when the water rises, thinking he'll wade through a shallow crossing. Current pulls him deeper than expected. Panics. Drowns. The coroner closed his notebook. It's not uncommon. The sheriff wasn't convinced, but he also wasn't interested in starting a murder investigation without evidence of foul play. Anyone report this man missing? A deputy checked his notes. Plantation owner named Beauregard Finch disappeared in July. Family filed a report saying he left to avoid creditors. Description matches. Age, build, clothing remnants. Creditors? The sheriff's interest sharpened. How much did he owe? Enough to run. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then that's your answer. Man flees his debts, tries to navigate the swamps, gets himself drowned. Close the file as accidental death. No point dragging this out. Ellis identified the body that afternoon. The sheriff asked if he recognized any personal effects. A ring, a watch, anything distinctive. Ellis pointed to a corroded belt buckle engraved with the initials BF and confirmed it matched his father's. Then he signed the death certificate without reading it and left. By evening, news had spread through the parish. Beauregard Finch, prominent planter, had died fleeing his creditors in a bayou accident. The story fit neatly into the narrative people already believed, that Beauregard had been in financial trouble, that he'd panicked, that he'd made a rash decision and paid the price. No one questioned it. No one looked deeper. Naomi watched Ellis return to Belle Azur that night and waited until they were alone before speaking. "How do you feel?" Ellis sat down heavily in his father's chair, his chair now, and stared at the empty fireplace. "I thought I'd feel something. Relief, maybe. Guilt. But it's just nothing. That's normal." "Is it?" Ellis looked at her. "I helped kill my father. That should feel like something." "Your father spent your whole life killing pieces of you," Naomi said quietly. "Maybe you're just even now." Ellis Finch became the sole owner of Belle Azur Plantation on September 10, 1847, when the probate court in Baton Rouge approved the transfer of assets. The process took 3 hours. Ellis signed papers, paid a $20 filing fee, and walked out with legal control over 1,700 acres, a manor house, 3 outbuildings, and 37 human beings. He burned the papers that night. Not the land deed, that he kept, but the bills of sale, the registration documents, the inventories that listed people's names next to their estimated dollar value. All of it went into the fireplace in his father's study. Ellis watched the flames consume the ledgers, the certificates, the carefully maintained records that had turned human beings into columns of profit and loss. Then he pulled out the stack of pre-signed manumission papers and began distributing them. The first went to Naomi. Ellis found her in the kitchen at dawn on September 11th, already working on the day's bread despite having barely slept. He set the document on the table without ceremony. "You're free," he said. "Effective immediately. You can leave today if you want. I'll give you money for passage to wherever you want to go." Naomi stared at the paper for a long moment. Then she laughed, sharp, disbelieving. "You're serious." "Completely. And the others?" "Everyone. By sunset, there won't be a single enslaved person on this property." Naomi picked up the document and read it carefully, checking for loopholes or conditions. Louisiana law made manumission complicated. It required proof of good character, approval from local authorities, and sometimes a bond posted by the enslaver to ensure the freed person wouldn't become a public burden. But Ellis had navigated all of it, paying lawyers and clerks to smooth the process. The papers were legitimate. "What happens to Belle Azur?" Naomi asked. "I sell it or let it rot. I haven't decided yet." "And you?" Ellis hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't know. Leave Louisiana, maybe. Start over somewhere that doesn't feel like a graveyard." Naomi set the paper down and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You know people are going to ask questions. Son frees all his father's slaves the day after inheriting? That's going to draw attention. Let it draw attention. I don't care. You should care, because if anyone starts digging, they're going to find the warrant that scared your father into running. And when they realize that warrant was fake..." She trailed off, letting the implication hang. Ellis felt cold certainty settle in his chest. "You're saying we need to be careful." "I'm saying we need to be smart. You free everyone today, people will wonder why. You free them gradually, over 6 months, claiming it's for religious reasons or some moral awakening. That's just an eccentric planter making eccentric choices. No one investigates eccentric." Ellis wanted to argue, to insist that every day he delayed was another day of captivity for people who'd already lost years to bondage. But Naomi was right. The system they'd operated in didn't allow for sudden virtue. It demanded plausible deniability, carefully managed narratives, the appearance of normalcy even when normalcy was a fiction. 6 months, Ellis agreed. "But I want your word that you'll stay. Help me manage the transition. Make sure everyone ends up where they want to be. Naomi studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll stay, but not as your employee, as your partner. You want my help? You pay me a salary and put it in writing. I'm done being anyone's property, Ellis. Even yours. Fair enough. They shook hands. It felt formal, transactional, but also right. The old relationship, whatever it had been, was gone. What remained was something new, built on survival and shared guilt, and the faint possibility of redemption. The manumission process took 7 months, not 6. Ellis freed people in small groups, staggering the paperwork to avoid suspicion. Some left immediately, heading north or west or back to New Orleans to search for family members who'd been sold years earlier. Others stayed, at least temporarily, because they had nowhere else to go, and Belle Azur offered wages, if nothing else. Naomi stayed the entire time, managing logistics with ruthless efficiency. She kept books, negotiated contracts, and made sure no one left without money in their pockets and documentation proving their legal status. She also made sure Ellis kept his promise. Every person who wanted to leave got help leaving. Every person who wanted to stay got fair compensation. The neighbors noticed, of course. Other planters in the parish watched Belle Azur's transformation with a mixture of confusion and hostility. A few sent letters asking if Ellis had lost his mind. One, a man named Godet, who owned a neighboring plantation, rode over in person to voice his concerns. "You're setting a dangerous precedent," Godet said, standing in Belle Azur's parlor with his hat in his hands. "Other slaves see what you're doing. They'll start getting ideas, demanding freedom, running away. You're undermining the whole system." "Good," Ellis replied. Godet stared at him. "You're not joking." "No." "Then you're a fool, or a traitor, possibly both." Godet left without another word, and within a week, rumors were circulating that Ellis Finch had become an abolitionist sympathizer, a dangerous label in Louisiana in 1848. Even more dangerous as the decade wore on and sectional tensions hardened. Ellis didn't care. He'd stopped caring about reputation the night his father died in the bayou. What he cared about now was simpler, making sure the people who'd survived Belle Azur got something resembling justice, even if justice came too late and too small. By April of 1848, every enslaved person who'd been on the property when Beauregard died was legally free. Some had left, some had stayed. A few, like Naomi, had become permanent fixtures, partners in the awkward project of turning a plantation into something that didn't rely on bondage. Ellis converted the cotton fields to food crops. He hired wage laborers to work the land and paid them fairly. He sold off the manor house's silver and furniture to cover operating costs. Slowly, painfully, Belle Azur stopped being a plantation and became something closer to a farm, still exploitative in the ways all agricultural labor was exploitative, but at least operating within frameworks of consent rather than coercion. Naomi watched the transformation with cautious approval. "You're not erasing what happened here," she said one evening in May. "You know that, right? The people who died, the families torn apart. Signing manumission papers doesn't undo any of that." "I know, but it's something, more than most people do." Ellis nodded. It was something. It had to be enough, because it was all he had to offer. The sheriff came back in June of 1848, 9 months after Beauregard's body had been found. He rode up to Belle Azur unannounced, dismounted in the yard, and asked to speak with Ellis privately. "I've been reviewing old files," the sheriff said once they were alone in the study. "Your father's case, the accidental drowning." Ellis kept his face neutral. What about it? I spoke to the coroner again, asked him to clarify a few details. The sheriff pulled out a notebook and flipped through pages. He mentioned the ledgers tied to your father's body, said they were too decomposed to read, but the rope and chains were high quality. Not the kind of thing a man running from creditors would have access to. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, just noting inconsistencies. The sheriff closed the notebook. I also spoke to a debt collector named Thibault. Asked him about the warrant that supposedly scared your father into running. Thibault swears he delivered it, but when I checked with the courts, there's no record of the complaint ever being filed. Ellis felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice steady. Bureaucratic errors happen all the time. True. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. But combined with the other inconsistencies, the rope, the chains, the timing, it starts to paint a picture. What kind of picture? The kind where someone wanted your father dead and made it look like an accident. The sheriff's eyes were cold, measuring. The question is whether I care enough to pursue it. The room was silent except for the ticking of Beauregard's old desk clock. Ellis forced himself to meet the sheriff's gaze without flinching. My father had enemies, Ellis said carefully. Business rivals. Creditors he'd defrauded. Any one of them could have wanted him gone. True, the sheriff said again. But most of those enemies were white men with resources and alibis. Your father's death benefited you most directly. You inherited everything. You freed all his slaves. You've been dismantling his legacy piece by piece. He paused. Some might say you had motive. And some might say I'm an eccentric son trying to atone for his father's sins. Ellis leaned forward. Sheriff, you can investigate this if you want. Spend months chasing inconsistencies and dead ends. But what will you find? A body that drowned in the bayou. A fake warrant that someone forged. No witnesses. No evidence tying anyone to the crime. He gestured toward the window. Meanwhile, 37 people who were enslaved are now free. Is that really a crime you want to solve? The sheriff was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, placing his hat back on his head. You make a compelling argument. I try. But if I ever find proof, real, solid proof, that you or anyone connected to you was involved in your father's death, I'll bring charges. Freeing slaves doesn't buy you immunity from murder. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. That woman, Naomi. She's still here, isn't she? She works for me, as a paid employee. The sheriff nodded slowly. Her brother, Samuel, he works a timber barge, was in the area around the time your father disappeared. That strike you as coincidental? Lots of bargemen were in the area. It's a river. Indeed. The sheriff tipped his hat. Good day, Mr. Finch. Ellis waited until the sheriff's horse had cleared the property line before allowing himself to breathe. Then he found Naomi in the kitchen and told her everything. He knows, Naomi said flatly, or suspects enough that it's the same thing. He can't prove anything. He doesn't need to. All he needs is a judge willing to take the word of a white sheriff over a white plantation owner who freed his slaves and a black woman who... She stopped, shaking her head. This doesn't end well for us, Ellis. Then we leave. Tonight. Head north. Change our names. Naomi looked at him with something between pity and exasperation. And go where? Do what? You think there's anywhere in this country where a white man and a black woman can just start over without questions? She pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. No. Running makes us look guilty. We stay. We keep our heads down. We trust that the sheriff values convenience over justice." Ellis wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Running would only confirm suspicions. Staying meant living with the constant fear of discovery, but it also meant maintaining the fragile plausibility they'd built over the past 9 months. "I'm sorry," Ellis said, "for dragging you into this. Stop," Naomi interrupted. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose this. I'd choose it again. But don't mistake what we did for heroism, Ellis. We killed a man, disposed of his body, covered it up. That's not justice. That's just survival disguised as virtue. The difference between justice and murder is who writes the history." Bellazur limped into the 1850s as a peculiar hybrid, part farm, part social experiment, part monument to crimes no one would name aloud. Ellis ran it with methodical efficiency, paying wages, rotating crops, maintaining buildings that slowly fell into disrepair because he couldn't afford proper upkeep and wouldn't borrow money to finance repairs. The manor house developed leaks, paint peeled, floorboards warped. Naomi stayed, though her reasons for staying grew more complicated with each passing year. She managed accounts, negotiated contracts with buyers, and became the de facto administrator of a property she'd once been enslaved on. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd traded bondage for wages, but the land itself remained haunted by everything that had happened there. The whippings, the separations, the quiet deaths no one had bothered to record. Some of the freed people returned occasionally, drawn back by family ties or the simple fact that Bellazur was the only home they'd ever known. They'd stay a few weeks, catch up on gossip, and then leave again, heading toward cities or smaller towns where they could disappear into growing black communities. Ellis welcomed them all, offered food and lodging, and never asked questions. The war came in 1861 and reshaped everything. Louisiana seceded. Confederate troops requisitioned supplies from plantations across the state. Ellis refused to contribute, claiming poverty and moral objections. The refusal earned him enemies, neighbors who accused him of disloyalty, officials who threatened seizure of his property. He paid fines, signed loyalty oaths he didn't believe, and kept his head down while the country tore itself apart. Naomi watched the war with a different kind of hope. "This is it," she said one evening in 1863, after news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Louisiana. "This is what we were waiting for. The whole system's going to collapse." Ellis wasn't so sure. Systems don't collapse, they adapt, find new ways to keep people in place. "You're too cynical. I'm realistic." The argument was old, familiar, a groove they'd worn into each other over 15 years of proximity. Naomi believed change was possible if you pushed hard enough. Ellis believed change was an illusion that made people feel better about perpetuating the same structures under different names. Neither could prove the other wrong. The war ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished. The world lurched toward something that might have been progress, or might have been just a different form of control. It was too early to tell. Ellis sold Bellazur in 1868 to a carpetbagger from Ohio, who planned to divide it into small parcels for freed families. The sale netted barely enough to cover debts and back taxes, but it was enough. Ellis and Naomi left Louisiana in September of 1868, taking a steamboat upriver to Memphis and then a train to Chicago, where no one knew their names or their history. They rented a small apartment above a tailor's shop and lived quietly, separately, two people tied together by shared guilt and the faint memory of something that might have been love before it was buried under layers of pragmatism and survival. Ellis Finch died in Chicago on March 12, 1901, at the age of 78. The obituary in the Chicago Tribune listed him as a retired merchant with ties to Louisiana, survived by no known family. Naomi attended the funeral alone, standing in the back of a near-empty chapel, while a minister who'd never met Ellis delivered platitudes about the peace of eternal rest. After the service, Naomi returned to the apartment they'd shared for 33 years and found the box Ellis had kept hidden in a locked trunk under his bed. Inside were the copied ledgers, the real account books from Belle Azure, documenting every fraudulent transaction, every falsified shipment, every debt that had never been real. Also inside, the original forged warrant that had sent Beauregard Finch running into the bayou, and beneath those, a letter addressed to no one. Naomi opened it. "If you're reading this, I'm dead. Good. I've been tired for a long time. I want to be clear about what happened in 1847. My father was a monster. He destroyed people for profit and called it business. I wanted him gone. Naomi wanted him gone. Her brother Samuel wanted him gone. We conspired. We forged documents. We created a trap. And when Beauregard walked into it, we closed the door and let him drown. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm stating facts. The plantation is gone now. The people who were enslaved there are free or dead or living lives I'll never know about. I signed papers. I paid wages. I tried to undo a fraction of the harm my father caused. But that doesn't erase what I did. Killing him didn't make me good. It just made me complicit in a different kind of violence. If there's a God, I'll answer to him. If there isn't, I'll answer to nothing. Either way, it's done." Naomi read the letter twice, then burned it in the kitchen stove. The ledgers, too. The forged warrant. All of it reduced to ash and smoke that drifted out the window and disappeared into the Chicago morning. There was no point preserving evidence of crimes everyone involved had already paid for in one way or another. She lived another 14 years, working as a seamstress and occasionally attending meetings of the local colored women's club, where she never spoke about Louisiana or plantations or men who drowned in bayous. When people asked about her past, she said she'd been born free in New Orleans and moved north during the war. It was easier than the truth. Naomi died in her sleep on August 7, 1915, at the age of 99. Her funeral was well attended. She'd become a respected figure in the community, known for her sharp mind and sharper tongue. No one mentioned Belle Azure. No one knew to. The land itself was subdivided and resold a dozen times over the next century. The manor house collapsed in the 1920s. The fields were paved over in the 1960s to build a highway. By the 21st century, no physical trace of Belle Azure remained, except a historical marker on a roadside rest stop that mentioned the property's role in Louisiana's plantation economy, without naming Beauregard Finch or his son or the 37 people who'd been enslaved there. But stories persisted. In the black communities that grew up around where Belle Azure had stood, people still told tales about the white planter who drowned in the bayou and the son who freed all his slaves. The details shifted with each retelling. Sometimes the son was a hero, sometimes a coward, sometimes something in between. Sometimes Naomi was just a housekeeper. Sometimes she was a witch who cursed the Finch family. Sometimes she was the one who tied the ledgers to Beauregard's waist and pushed him under. The truth, as always, was more complicated than legend. On quiet nights in southern Louisiana, when the bayou fog rolls thick and the cypress trees creak in the wind, locals sometimes claim they can still hear a man calling for help near the old Belle Azure property line. a voice that sounds like drowning, desperate, answered by nothing but water and silence. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.